in love with compost for well over a decade. I've used it liberally throughout all of my gardening projects. But in the recent video I shared, I explained that I basically have a pile of poisoned compost thanks to some herbicide contamination. So I can't use any of this in my garden this year, and I'm sitting over here trying to figure out how can I continue to nurture my soil without the use of compost. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you some of the things I've been doing that you can do too, how to build your soil health even if you have zero compost pile. So first off, I want you to know this is not an anti-compost video because I still adore compost. It's always going to be my first choice if I have good compost available, but I know that some of you are probably in the same boat as I am. Maybe you haven't started your compost pile yet, or it's contaminated, or you just moved and you don't have your system going and you still want to nurture your garden. Well, there's still some things you can use to do that that doesn't necessarily have to involve a compost pile. One thing I didn't understand when I first started gardening is how important soil health is. I kind of just was like, it's dirt, it's fine, it's all the same, but it's really not. And as we are working on creating better quality gardens and more vegetables, we need to start with the soil. We need to look at what our soil composition is. We need to be paying attention to the nutrients in the soil and adding in as much organic matter as possible. And if you don't have compost, a really good source for organic matter is, believe it or not, your kitchen. Okay, so one of my favorite kitchen byproducts to use is whey. Now, whey, as some of you may know, is a byproduct of making cheese or other dairy products. Really important note here, this whey that I'm using in my garden is not the same as the powdered whey that you might get at the health food store. This is an entirely different animal. This is actual whey that was from a batch of mozzarella cheese I made last night. Now, the cool thing about whey is that it has little bits of elements that your garden really likes and that will help your garden be more productive. Things like nitrogen, a little bit of phosphorus, a little bit of potassium. And as long as you're using a sweet whey, we'll talk about that in a minute, you don't have to worry about these nutrients being too much for your garden. You can just pour it on and call it good. So an important thing to remember if you are adding whey Important thing to remember if you are adding whey to your garden. There's a couple different types of whey that you may end up with after making a cheese recipe. So sweet whey would come from a cheese that you are using more traditional practices to make. You add a little bit of culture, you add some rennet, you leave the pot on the stove, and then you go through the cheese making process. The whey that's left over from that is ideal for your garden and it won't be too strong or damage your plants. Now, on the other hand, we have something called acid whey, and that would be left over from the cheeses where you add in citric acid or lemon juice or vinegar. And that way you need to be a little more careful with because it has that extra acid and it can burn your plants if you put it on the garden. Ask me how I know. I killed an entire bed of tomatoes one year because I didn't know the difference. So with this whey, for example, it is a whey that I added citric acid to because I made mozzarella. And so I'm not going to be applying this to my garden straight. Whereas when I have the other whey, I'll just dump it right on the beds around my plants and they do just fine. If you have powdery mildew issues in your garden, you can actually use your whey to make a simple spray for that. You just would want to dilute the whey 50-50 with water. So I'm going to fill up my quart jar halfway. I'm going to put this in a jar that actually will fit my sprayer. Okay, and now, I'm just going to add my mason jar sprayer lid. Quick shake. And then I can just go spray this on any plants where I want to deter powdery mildew from showing up. You could also use this as a foliar spray or a leaf spray for any plants that need a little extra boost, or just spray it around the base of the plant for a light bit of fertilizer. Next up, we have the infamous coffee grounds. This is something that every article on the internet will tell you to put on your garden or not to put on your garden. Honestly, I'm kind of on the fence. I feel like they can be beneficial, but you definitely want to have some forethought before you just go dump them in the garden. Coffee grounds are going to add some organic matter to your soil, They may or may not be acidic depending on what type of grounds you use, or if they're used or they're brand new. It just really depends. However, there is a chance they will create a more acidic environment, so it's wise to keep the coffee grounds on the plants that like acid, like blueberries, carrots, radishes. They're all going to do great with a little bit of coffee grounds. Just make sure when you are putting the grounds in your garden, you're not clumping them together, you're just kind of sprinkling them on the top. And keep them away from your young plants or any seeds that may be germinating. There are some studies that show they could hamper germination just a bit, so better safe than sorry. So right along with the coffee grounds, we have a lot of claims around the banana for the garden, or rather banana peels. So I haven't found a lot of cold, hard data to really prove the effectiveness of banana peels for the garden, but it's not going to hurt. You know, there's some people say don't use them, or it's a scam or whatever. They're not going to hurt anything. They just may not add as much as some of the internet articles would love you to believe. Even though bananas do have potassium in them, it's not necessarily going to add a ton of potassium to your garden. But again, it's organic matter, it's saving food waste from the trash. And so if you like, you can just take your banana peels and throw them in your compost pile. You can chop them up into little bits and sprinkle them around your soil or dig them into your soil. Or if you want, you could even make banana tea. Definitely don't want to drink this, but all you do is just stick the banana peels in a jar, fill it up with some water, let this steep for 3 days, strain out the peels, and you can spray this on the leaves of your plants or pour it in your garden beds. It's not going to be hot, it's not going to do any damage, and who knows, it might add a little bit of extra goodness to the soil. Does your garden need a calcium supplement? Well, I don't know. You have to get it tested to know for sure. Not all soils need more calcium, but if you do, or you suspect that you do, eggshells can be a source of calcium with a few considerations. So there's a lot of articles out there that'll just tell you to dig eggshells into your soil or to coarsely grind them and toss them in there. And the studies have shown that that's not super effective. It takes a long time for the eggshells to break down enough to add the nutrients into the soil. So to get the maximum calcium benefit, you would either want to finely grind these up in like a food processor or a blender, or you can make an eggshell tea. And we got our banana tea, and now we have our eggshell tea. You would just put these in a pan of water, maybe 20 eggshells or so, cover it up, let it simmer, and then let those eggshells sit for about 24 hours before you strain out the shells and then you use the water in your garden. So some of those things I just showed you may or may not have, documented proof that they work, but there's one thing that I know works, and I do have the proof, and that would be mulch. You've heard me talk about how much I love mulch in other videos. So not only does it help on the top of the soil by suppressing weeds and holding in moisture, but it also breaks down over time and creates organic matter in the soil, nurtures the soil, and I have seen such a huge improvement in my soil structure by using mulch over the years. So I love grass clippings as mulch. You could also use hay or straw or old leaves. It kind of just depends on what you have. So as you use mulch, there's a few things to keep in mind. Number one, you want to make sure that it's not contaminated with herbicides of any kind. So I use our grass clippings because we don't spray our lawn with anything. And if I'm using hay, I'm going to make sure that I'm using an organic hay or a hay that hasn't been sprayed with the aminopyralids that I talked about in that previous video. That will cause havoc in your garden so fast, and it's heartbreaking when that happens. The other thing that I get a lot of questions about would be seeds. They're like, oh my gosh, you can't use grass clippings because you're going to seed your garden with grass. And honestly, I haven't had big issues with that. It does depend on what type of clippings you're using. If you're mowing a pasture that has big old seed heads in it, maybe don't use that in your garden. But typical lawn clippings, I just haven't had an issue. And one of the things I do is I apply my layer really thick. Like when I used hay as a mulch, I do 8 to 10 inches of hay, and that helps to suppress those grass seeds in there. And I had very little issue, really no more issue than normal with grass coming up in my garden. So for me, it's a win-win. And as this breaks down, it just does wonders for the soil. And lastly, one other option that you can use that's right up there with mulch in terms of how well it works would be cover crops. So you may have seen in a previous video, I had these 4 beds planted with rye, and initially the rye was really tall. It looked like a farmer's field full of rye, and I chopped that down right before planting time, and I put my tomatoes right in the rye stubble. And you can see here, well actually you probably can't see, this looked like a dead lawn that I planted my tomatoes in, and that was a couple months ago, and it's already breaking down. Like you can hardly even see the rye stubble. I just kind of covered it with grass clippings to help suppress any leftover growth. These tomatoes have grown beautifully in this stubble, and the reason I put this rye in is because this soil wasn't great. It was really heavy with clay. It was a pain to dig up in the beginning of the year, and I just hated these beds. And so by putting this rye in, I'm adding organic matter, I'm breaking up that heavy clay, I'm adding nutrients in because I'm letting that rye decompose right here in the bed, and I'm really, really happy with the results. So if you can't use compost in your garden, do some research into cover crops. They're pretty much magic for the organic gardener. So if you are looking for some organic pest control options in addition to these organic fertilizer options, you will love the tips I share in this video.